in our Bundle Payment Best Practices web conference, How to Make CJR a Success, Negotiating Gainsharing Agreements webinar. I want to welcome everybody today. CJR, we were just discussing, is definitely, we believe, going to be a beachhead for further bundle payment initiatives coming out of CMS, as indicated by their own proclamations, and we're excited about today's conference, our second in this series of webcasts in this area, and we're also delighted to co-sponsor this with Avalier Consulting. This is an area that is it is and demands multidisciplinary expertise for healthcare providers. On the one hand, there's certainly legal issues associated with contracting and fraud and abuse waivers and how to do things consistent with the regulations and the programmatic as well as the other waivers that are applicable here. Conversely, and equally as important, are the data analytics, the cost statistics, the quality data, et cetera. So we've partnered in this conference, as we have on substantive matters, with Avalier, and they've been a terrific teammate to us in advising clients in a coordinated way in an area that I think truly demands that. So we have a great panel with us today. First of all, I want to introduce them real briefly. My colleague Fred Gaiofas counsels health systems, hospitals, medical clinics, nursing homes, and other healthcare providers on general operational concerns, regulatory, and business matters. He has many years of experience in healthcare acquisitions, integrated delivery issues, managed care contracting, and the defense of providers against government enforcement actions. Secondly, from Avalier Consulting, we're joined by Fred Bentley. Fred is a vice president at Avalier. He advises clients on health delivery and payment innovation, providing analytical and strategic insight on issues related to the delivery of care. As an expert in fields ranging from payer strategy to hospital-physician alignment and post-acute care, he has worked with providers, including integrated delivery networks, AMCs, post-acute providers, and others, as well as national and regional health plans. Before we start, I just want to go over a couple of housekeeping tips. Today's program is going to run for 60 minutes. We're going to apply one general CLE credit for today's program. For those of you interested in CLE, please listen carefully for the code that will be announced during today's broadcast. Once you hear the code, please enter it in the pop box that will appear on your screen. All New York, New Jersey, and Kansas attendees applying for CLE credit must also fill out an attorney affirmation form, which can be found in the resource list widget on your screen. Electronic questions can be submitted throughout the broadcast by clicking on the Q&A tab at the bottom of your screen, and we'll answer those questions at the end of the broadcast. Slides can also be obtained in the resource widget on your toolbar. With that, today the format is going to be fourfold. First of all, Fred Gaiofas, I'll refer to him as Fred G, is going to give us an overview of the CJR program as a table setter, much more condensed version of what we did last time so that we can orient, really the core of the discussion we're going to have today, which is our Q&A session. Secondly, Fred B from Avalier is going to discuss we call it leveraging the data, and he is going to address some of the data analytical cost and quality metrics that go into the decisions of how to implement CJR. And then we have a series of roundtable discussions that we're going to bang around between the three of us, which are going to get into sort of the juicy questions of when, how, and with whom to execute this strategy, and touch on, we hope, the key legal strategy and data analytics points that are going to be necessary to implement CJR. So, and then finally, of course, we hope we have time remaining for Q&A, and we'll make every effort to reserve time for Q&A. So with that, I'm going to hand it off now to my partner, Fred Gaiofas, to give us a brief overview of the CJR program. Fred?
Thanks very much, Chris. Since the introduction of the Affordable Care Act, there have been a number of alternative payment models, and the latest and the first mandatory one is the CJR program. Actually, there have been a couple announced since then, but and as you know, CMS has has indicated they want to have 50% payments within alternative payment models within the next couple of years, and we think that mandatory programs like this are going to be the way they're going to get there. They're going to have to do mandatory programming. It's mandatory for 67 metropolitan statistical areas, and it covers approximately 800 hospitals. This program covers joint replacements, DRGs 469 and 470, and it covers an episode of care. It's referred to as a bundled payment program, which we'll talk about a little in a minute, but it really covers an episode of care that commences with the inpatient stay for the hospitalization for one of these DRGs, and then it covers all the costs through the hospitalization and 90 days post-acute. All Part A and Part B services are included, with limited exceptions that really don't relate to these kind of episodes. It's a 5-year program, so all the included hospitals are in for 5 years. The first year is upside only. If the episode comes in under the target, there will be bonus money. After the first year, there is upside and downside, so there may be an obligation to repay if the costs come in above the episode target. While it's referred to as a bundled payment program frequently, there really is no bundled payment made as such. Excuse me one second. There's no bundle payment as such. All parties continue to bill fee-for-service as they always have. The hospital builds its DRG. All the providers bill fee-for-service, and then they collect and measure all the Medicare payments that are made during the episode and against an episode target price that is set for each year. And if you exceed the target, you owe money back, and if you're under the target, you can be entitled to some bonus money. The episode target is based on 3 years of historic data, and it is set as indicated here. In the first and second year, the data is based on each hospital's specific cost, and 1/3 on the regional costs. In year 3, the hospital specific goes down to 1/3, and it's 2/3 regional. And in years 4 and 5, it's 100% based on regional costs. So if you are on the high end, in the first couple of years, your hospital specific costs will be part of the target, 2/3 part of the target. But after year 3, it's 100% regional, and you got to get your costs in line, or you'll be owing money back. There also are ways that quality performance impacts the payment. In essence, you need to meet quality criteria, minimum quality criteria, to be entitled to any gain sharing. And there's also some quality bonuses. There's a discount rate of 3%, which is essentially the Medicare share portion of the first 3% goes to Medicare. There are caps that are built in on the sharing, and there's percentage sharing that varies over time. As we've seen with other alternative payment models, there are some programmatic waivers, and they propose to waive the 3-day inpatient stay before a SNF admission, so long as the SNF to which there is an admission has at least a 3-star rating. The incident to direct supervision for physician home visits is waived, and there are telehealth waivers for geographic site geographic site requirement. There is a little bit of flexibility in the preferred providers listing that needs to be provided by a hospital for those who are being discharged from the hospital. A hospital may develop a preferred panel and may recommend a provider, but it has to give a list of all the post-acute providers in the community and indicate whether it has a sharing agreement with that with which providers. You are entitled to recommend. A hospital may recommend a particular preferred provider, which is perhaps a clarification of existing law, perhaps an extension. But one thing that is clear is once the family member or the patient expresses a preference, that preference has to be honored. And hospitals can get in trouble for ignoring those preferences. They can't just steer to their panel members. The free choice of beneficiaries remains sacrosanct, if you will. Just trying to switch a slide here. The hospital is really at the core, unlike the bundled payment for care initiative, where there can be different entities that are involved. The hospital is at the core and takes the risk on managing the episode at the risk of owing money back or receiving the bonus money. The hospital shares in the upside and downside and may contract. It has to enter a contract with what are referred to as collaborators, providers, if it wants to share either the upside or the downside. There can be no sharing without first entering into a collaborator agreement, and those can't be retroactive. So if you enter the collaborator agreement halfway through the year, it can only be episodes that the sharing can only relate to episodes that occur after that point in time. The regulations specify a number of contract requirements that have to be included in a valid sharing agreement, and they're very specific. And if you're putting together a contract, you're going to want to make sure you meet those requirements. The hospital is limited by regulation and must keep at least 50% of the downside. There also is a limit that no collaborator can be responsible for more than 25% of the downside. And on the upside, there is a limit that the physicians cannot be rewarded with more than 50% of the total Medicare approved amounts under the physician fee schedule. There also are fraud and abuse waivers with respect to the CJR program. There are 3 waivers. They're narrower and much more specific than the waivers we've seen in the Medicare Shared Savings Program. They're very specific. We also mentioned there are no waivers for infrastructure payments or return on investment payments, but there are waivers for distribution of gain sharing payments, distributions from a physician practice group to a practice collaboration agent, and there's also a waiver for patient engagement payments. I'd also like to mention, before I turn it over to Fred Bentley, that when we talk about regional targets, it's not a region. The MSMA is not the region. There are 9 regions across the country, and you're going to want to know how you stack up against episodes in your hospital stack up against that region that you've been assigned to, and obviously. Their target prices established for the 9 census regions, and those are, as we mentioned earlier, the regional portion of the target increases over time and becomes 100% in years 4 and 5. So if your costs are over that regional target and you can't get them in line through collaborations and the like or redesign, you may very well be owing money back. At this point, I'd love to turn it over to Fred Bentley and dig into the numbers a little bit. Fred?
All right. Thank you, Fred G. Actually, that last point is critical, and it's a great jumping off point for the slides that I'm going to be walking through here briefly before we get to the Q&A section. And again, as Fred G. was pointing out, and really where I think hospitals have to start, and the hospitals we've been working with have been guiding them, is yes, early on, your costs are going to be, you're going to be looking at your historical performance and compare it against that. But very quickly, the model moves to a regional pricing model. And what I've sketched out here, and I know that maybe somewhat hard to read, but essentially what we have done is modeled out for the Mid-Atlantic census region how hospitals would do in an environment or in the case where CMS has moved to that fully regional pricing model. So looking at who are the winners and losers in that regional pricing arrangement. And exactly to Fred's point, there are several MSAs that are part of this Mid-Atlantic region. So it runs from basically everywhere where I am, which is I'm dialing in from Washington, D.C., so the market here on up, Boston is not part of it, so Chris is not in a CJR market per se, but very close to it, all the way up to Connecticut. And obviously that includes some huge markets, most notably the New York, New Jersey market. So what we've highlighted here, again, are looking at on net who stands to lose and who stands to gain under a regional-based arrangement in this Middle Atlantic census region. I think key takeaways here, perhaps very obvious, there was one facility, and they won't go named, who's a big winner here. By our count, could net something close to $4 million. Now, this is all modeling based on some older data, or somewhat older data, but gives you sort of a range. So one big winner here, but then by our count, roughly 25 to 30% of hospitals in this market could be losing north of $500,000 a year. So not chump change. And it really starts to beg the question of, okay, so if that first step, as the slide title suggests, is what is our financial position relative to our region? Even if in the early years we're going to be looking at our historical average, we need to understand right now how we look compared to the market so that we can start really understanding the magnitude of the change. The next big question is, where are we going to find savings? Where are we going to be able to gain efficiency so that we bring our costs down below the regional average? That actually starts to tee up this next slide, where what I've showed here is for a typical lower joint replacement procedure, which costs Medicare roughly $25,000, and that ranges from a low of about $16,000 to closer to $40,000, depending on whether it's a fracture or if we're talking about a total or partial hip or knee procedure. So there's a lot of variation, but on average it's about $25,000. And this pie chart, as I said, really breaks down spending by care setting. So you can see here a couple of key things. First of all, just in terms of the total size, the costs associated with that initial hospital stay are really the biggest part of the costs. So certainly a big part of the cost, but I think as we're working with our hospital clients and talking with hospitals more broadly, I think the reality is that there are a lot of things that, and we'll touch back on this in the Q&A part, there are a lot of things hospitals can do to bring their own internal costs down so that they can generate savings. But really, the same incentives have applied under CJR as they did under the DRG-based model. Because, really what's happening under CJR is we're kind of blowing that whole thing out, and now you as a hospital are on the hook for the 90 days of post-discharge care. And as we've highlighted here, roughly 40% of the dollars, and it goes up depending on whether the patient has a readmission or not, but 40% of the spend is tied to the post-discharge component of the episode. So this is sort of an interesting cut, again, still at a relatively high level, but starts to give a sense for where are the costs, where might the opportunities be to start generating savings. And not surprisingly, hospitals are starting to look at that post-acute piece, managing the readmissions as well as thinking about are we sending patients to SNF when they don't need to go there, going to skilled nursing or inpatient rehab? Could they manage be managed through home health. And again, these are all sort of new questions, new sets of data that hospitals are grappling with. And just to give you a sense, as we continue peeling back the onion and getting a sense for where the opportunities lie, there's quite dramatic variation across markets, and even with between institutions or between hospitals within any given market, as to how they're using post-acute care for their lower joint patients. What I've highlighted here on slide 10 is looking at 3 different CJR markets. So the top line is Beaumont, Port Arthur, so in southeast Texas. The middle bar is the New York, Newark, Jersey City MSA, and then the lower bar is the LA, Long Beach, Anaheim MSA. And just looking at what were the discharge destinations by care setting for major joint replacement, Medicare major joint replacement patients. Pretty amazing here. Obviously won't read all the details, but you look at Beaumont, where roughly 41% of all of the patients are being discharged to an inpatient rehab facility. Compare that with LA, where it's 8%. So dramatic variation, and obviously, we could put up all the CJR markets, all 67 of them, and you would see lots of different variations. Suffice to say, that is not all related to patient acuity. There are lots of different factors driving this. But I think the big realization for hospitals is, again, I think focusing on 2 things in terms of generating savings and also potentially better outcomes with respect to post-acute care. So one of those is again, driving down the use of high-cost institutional care, so in IRFs and skilled nursing facilities, leveraging home health whenever possible. And then the other piece, and this is where I'll spend a few slides and where we'll also circle back to in the conversation, is developing preferred networks. So if I'm a hospital and I'm driving down SNF utilization, I will still need to use SNFs and inpatient rehab facilities to a certain extent. But the big question is, who am I going to work with? So if I do need to discharge patients to these higher cost settings, can I create preferred networks? And Fred G. started to touch on some of the aspects of that in terms of setting up preferred networks and patient choice. But I think increasingly what we're seeing and hearing are organizations that are saying it's not enough just to have preferred SNF network, which is a narrow set of skilled nursing facilities that are high quality, high value. We also want them to have some skin in the game, i.e., have our incentives aligned around better care and better management of the lower joint cases. So there is a gain sharing option. Again, as Fred G. noted, CMS has laid out some of the requirements related to that. And highlighted on this slide is just on the left-hand side the full range of entities that can be part of a gain sharing arrangement. And obviously it includes individual physicians, physician practices, and then essentially every post-acute care setting can be a part of this. And these arrangements can be both have an upside and downside component, or they can be upside only. I think our early take, and we'll again come back to this in the conversation, I would imagine we'll see a lot of upside and downside. I don't think we're going to see just upside only arrangements, but it's in the early goings. Another quick point on this gain sharing. Or the set of considerations around gain sharing. There are essentially 2 principal forms of payment. So on that top part of the diagram here on slide 12, the gain sharing payments that can be made from the hospital to the collaborators, so the post-acute providers or physicians that are in the gain sharing arrangement. These gain sharing payments can be paid out of either the reconciliation payments that CMS makes to the hospital if they perform well under CJR and earn the bonus. But the hospitals can pay out the gain sharing payment to the collaborators based on internal cost savings. Conversely, there are alignment payments. So the collaborators would have to return payments and basically face a penalty if the collaborator misses the targets that are spelled out in the collaboration agreement, and the CJR hospital is also getting penalized. So the dollars flow both ways. And again, I think that's where we're going to see a lot of these agreements, so that there's an upside and a downside. Before we get to the Q&A, I just want to give you a pretty simple example here, but I think just to clarify how this would work, the gain sharing arrangement. So this is a case where we've got a hospital that has generated $20,000 in essentially a savings pool. 10,000 of those dollars came from hitting their quality goals and keeping costs below their target, so that they got a $10,000 from CMS through reconciliation payment. And then they also improved efficiencies in terms of internal costs and were able to generate an additional $10,000, so a cumulative $20,000. And in this case, they dispersed roughly $4,000 through their collaboration agreements to physician practice, a skilled nursing facility, other providers, and then obviously keep a portion of the savings that they've generated, or a portion of that savings pool. So clearly, a simplified example gets a lot more complicated. That's why I'm very glad to have folks like Chris and Fred G. dialed in, who know the legal components of this. But again, just wanted to give you a sense for what this could look like. So with that, we are going to shift over to the Q&A piece, and I'll pass the floor back over to you, Chris.
Thank you, Fred B. Appreciate that. And that was a terrific overview by you guys, and hitting some of the data and analytic features that I think definitely have to go into some of the modeling of these CJR collaboration agreements that hospitals should be thinking about. So we have, for the audience benefit, we have a list of about, looks like about 10 or 15 questions here that I think are going to draw out some of the salient negotiation features and things hospitals and providers should be thinking about. So we'll be sort of tossing these questions around and engaging in an interactive discussion, at least amongst the three of us. And again, we encourage questions. We've already got a couple from the audience so far that we've received, and we'll be answering those, or trying to answer those as we continue the discussion. But let me just start off with maybe this question. Hospital DRGs have been in effect for years. And one of the questions I think people might have, are there really further opportunities under CJR for savings during the hospitalization? Understanding the episode includes both the hospitalization and a 90-day post-discharge period, which sort of, I guess, begs the question of where the savings are going to come from. How are the savings going to be generated if generating them by reducing inpatient costs below DRGs, as I expect, is going to be difficult. Fred G., do you have any thoughts on that? Fred, you might have your mute line on, but let me...
I did have it on. Thank you.
No problem.
The question is accurate. I mean, hospitals have been working the DRGs and working to reduce the costs so that they make money on DRGs for many years. So the opportunities may be more limited on the hospital side. At the same time, if they reduce the costs, the amount included in the target, at least directly, is the hospital DRG, so the target won't be affected by those cost savings, although the hospital will benefit in terms of cost savings. And one thing that with the waivers that are part of the CJR program, there may be some opportunities to engage participants that bring costs into the DRG that are reimbursed through the DRG to get them to the table and engaged in care redesign kind of arrangements that will further reduce costs. So there's some opportunity with the waivers that are in the CRG program that create some opportunities along those lines.
Yeah, I sort of echoing what you just said, Fred. I think the real savings are going to come from the care redesign. I've read that there are hospitals that are now sort of inviting post-acute providers, not so much into into the episode at the traditional point, which is at the discharge point, but almost on the admission and intake, and doing things called that are sort of vernacularly referred to as prehab, and designed to encourage patient engagement much earlier in the process, that will speed recovery and obviously lower readmission and enhance functional measurement gains and those kinds of things. So and I note the other thing is, and I think we may have talked about it in the last session, Fred, but if there are internal cost savings to the hospitals, that it can be actually documented, as opposed to the amounts that are billing under fee-for-service to Medicare. Those costs can also be distributed, but my sense is that those costs are going to be largely related to care design and really focused on the overall episode. Fred B, any thoughts before we move on from that question on your side?
Yeah, I think what's interesting, exactly as Fred G pointed out, and as we've been discussing, hospitals have been at this for the better part of 30-plus years in terms of trying to manage length of stay, manage device utilization or device costs as a result of the DRG. And if you think about it, CJR is just basically blowing out the DRG model to a sort of a 90-plus day episode. And as a result, there will still be opportunities to improve efficiencies on the inpatient side. But in terms of where I honestly think a lot of the big opportunities, and I don't want to call it low-hanging fruit, because none of this is going to be quote unquote easy to come by or something that you can do without really thinking through what the clinical implications are and ensuring that it's going to achieve efficiencies as well as, or achieve savings as well as improve outcomes. But I think there are a couple of key areas where our hospital clients are starting to look, and where we're helping to guide them with the data, which is, readmissions are not, relative to other types of procedures and other conditions, readmissions are not the percentages are not that quite as high when you're talking about lower joint procedures. But that said, when there is a readmission, it is incredibly expensive. It almost doubles the cost of the procedure. It can, in terms of what Medicare is spending. So it makes a lot of sense to really hone in on the readmissions piece. And what's interesting here, and this is where the work that we do with our post-acute providers, I think, is starting to help inform, and where they're helping to inform hospitals, is that readmissions amongst patients with cognitive issues and behavioral health issues is significantly higher, even within the lower joint patient population. So really honing in on that group is an opportunity, and a near-term opportunity, to start driving down or start achieving savings. I think the other big one, above and beyond managing readmissions much more effectively, is starting to look at, are we relying really heavily on inpatient rehab facilities and skilled nursing organizations for cases that could potentially move to the home health setting. And again, I want to caution that this is not something that you just rush to and try and move your percentages to the regional average or state average or national average, just given patient acuity and patient needs, and honestly capacity in the market to manage those patients. But that said, I do see that as a real opportunity, and in fact, there are some gains in some organizations that have had a lot of success in developing these preferred post-acute care networks and managing those effectively.
Thanks, Fred. That's actually a good sort of lead into the next question we had, which is how do hospitals sort of select some of their strategic, since hospitals really are at the hub of this, how do they go about putting a network together, or who their collaborators are going to be? What kind of criteria do they use? And other than the obvious with respect to physician practices that are key referral sources, I tend to agree with you. I think the low-lying fruit in terms of cost reduction and readmission risk probably is on the post-acute side, given that slide you presented with the significant component, not only being post-acute, but the high level of variability I think you see in the data that shows the variations in quality with respect to post-acute. And I think if I'm advising a hospital, you certainly have to look at quality metrics for post-acute, and some of that is, Nursing Home Compare and CMS websites. Some of it isn't available yet due to the impact law and needs to be measured, somewhat on a more proprietary basis. But the other thing I'm thinking is, with one thing that Fred G. mentioned about the preeminency of patient choice, I would think that post-acute operators that have some, both geographic and vertical scale to them are going to be more attractive in this market, such that, you don't get what we refer to as sort of patient leakage, where, patients have the ultimate choice to go to a provider who's not, engaged in the bundle as a collaborator. And you really, consistent with the fraud and abuse laws on patient choice, want that person to go to someone who has a collaborator agreement with the hospital. So I would think that in terms of setting up a network of collaborators here, that hospitals would, on balance, although quality is obviously the most important, perhaps, want companies that have some scale and depth, and maybe even companies that have vertical integration to them, including the full suite of post-acute services. And in addition, someone with some financial strength, because if there are some reconciliation payments, or I guess alignment payments is the terminology that the regulations use, you want to have a party that can sort of stand behind that and make those payments. And I guess finally you'd want somebody that has experience in bundle payments, even if perchance it wasn't a successful experience, somebody who has had, for example, experience with the voluntary bundle payment care initiative program. So that I mean, in my own eyes, I know that's sort of a roundabout way of saying there's a lot of factors to be considered there, but at least in my view, those are some of the features I think a hospital would be well advised to take a look at. Do you guys have any thoughts on that?
I think also it may well be that the lower cost post-acute providers, probably the home care agencies, may be ones that could see an uptick in business to the extent that you can get a patient into the home consistently with quality care. That may be the lower cost setting. Yeah. And the other thing is, with this program, it's really the first time the hospital cares I think they care on readmission risks, but and just in a sense of quality, but financially they care where the patient is cared for after the discharge. So they're going to be involved much more significantly in that post-discharge decision.
Absolutely, and that's something we've been doing work on for quite some time. In terms of forming post-acute care preferred networks. And Fred G, exactly to your point, the vast majority of hospitals and health systems were not paying a lot of attention to what was going on in the post-acute setting, but we were working with ACOs, and particularly those that were assuming some significant downside risks, so really looking at how do we manage, in this case, not only episodes of care, but longitudinally, over a 12-month time frame. How do we manage costs? So we've created essentially a framework that helps work through, how you start to set up effective post-acute care networks. And Chris, to your point, clearly, you're pulling in the quality data, looking at the readmissions data, and really understanding performance there. It's almost, that's sort of the first filter or first cut. And then it really starts to get to, and I think both of you all were starting to touch on this, is this an organization that has experience managing bundles? So, it's a plus if you've been, if it's a post-acute organization that's been part of the Bundle Payments for Care Improvement, or BPCI program. We work with a number of those organizations, and they really, they have started doing the heavy lifting around improving management in the post-acute realm. So there are a number of those considerations. I think the other piece of this, and Chris, you started to touch on this, with the bigger, more sophisticated, more vertically integrated post-acute providers, I think it's, they are more financially sophisticated. Another really big part of this is they actually have the health IT infrastructure. And even, maybe it's not quite as sophisticated as what you see in a hospital or even in a physician practice, but those bigger organizations, those bigger national and regional organizations, are going to have the infrastructure to exchange data, which obviously is absolutely essential to making this whole thing work. You know, and I would just add, it's sort of interesting side note here. I think, you know, Chris, your point around some of these larger groups or larger post-acute care organizations having a leg up. We're seeing some SNF organizations, companies, starting to buy SNF beds in markets in anticipation of, you know, as the industry starts to move more to a bundle payment model or shifting more risk to hospitals, we want to be, you know, a big player in this market and manage a lot of beds so that, you know, we have a seat at the table. So just an interesting sort of result of a lot of this payment reform that's taking place.
Interesting.
Yeah, hopefully you didn't sell those beds that you were warehousing for posterity purposes. But let me, you know, a couple, as you were talking there, Fred B., a couple of things came to mind. One, you were talking about IT systems, and there was a question from the audience here about waivers, and Fred Galfus mentioned it. Unlike the ACO program, there's no fraud and abuse waiver for infrastructure payments, you know, like IT system payments here. So if there are costs associated with, you know, care coordination, IT software programs that need to be connected to electronic health records or other types of infrastructure payments that are financial contributions from the parties, you know, the parties are going to have to find a fraud and abuse waiver or a safe harbor or something close, not a waiver, but there is no waiver, but a fraud and abuse safe harbor or something close to it that sort of qualifies, you know, for regulatory safe harbor, or as I said, otherwise. So that's actually an important difference between the CJR bundle and the ACOs with respect to IT. And then the other thing I'd say is, you know, when you're talking about the selection, the other thing we've seen is sort of some novel delivery models that have been starting to evolve. You said, Fred Galfus, about home health, and we're starting to see orthopedic practices develop, for example, their own sort of short-term post-discharge respite facilities. We're starting to see assisted living facilities sort of dedicate you know, a small component of their wing to people recovering, you know, on a short-term basis from, you know, hip and knee surgery under the bundle, augmented by home health. You know, so there's some, you know, and of course at a much lower cost than a SNF stay would be. So I think there's going to be some interesting new delivery models and opportunities as this stuff evolves. But I just wanted to sort of, you know, point out those two concepts. Moving along here, because you can see we have a lot of questions and we're still plowing through this, but how about academic medical centers? I'm thinking that if they're thrown into a regional cost structure, there could be some pain here for academic medical centers, which have an inherently higher cost structure. Fred G., what do you think? Is that, I mean, what is that accurate, or and how do you handle mitigating, I guess, that risk?
Well, I think to the extent academic medical centers or tertiary providers have higher cost structures for their CJR programs, they've got to get focused sooner rather than later. It will be a regional cost in two-thirds regional in year 3, and 100% regional cost in years 4 and 5. And if you're an outlier on the high side in costs, and I found Fred B.'s slide very interesting about how many losers, you know, it's older data, but still how many losers could be projected from a particular region. I wouldn't be surprised if the academic centers with their, you know, just the cost structures they have might be on the high side, and they just need to get focused, get their collaborator networks together, focused on the post-acute, particularly as we've been discussing, and come up with some strategies to mitigate those higher cost structures.
Yeah, I would just add, this is Fred B. Jumping in. I think one of the interesting things when we worked with and when I've looked at the data for academic medical centers, to the extent that they are, they have a higher cost structure, but they also tend to be high volume, regional, super regional hubs. So they're bringing in patients from a much broader geographic network than a sort of community hospital that's doing some bread and butter lower joint cases. And as a result, they're also working with significantly more skilled nursing facilities, home health providers, than a general acute care non-academic facility, and that's a problem. I suppose for obvious reasons, in that first of all, you don't know the quality of the settings, and you're going to need to know about that now. The quality of care that's being delivered. The cost structure is going to be more difficult to manage that. And the other reality, and this is where some of the interesting work comes in with academic medical centers, is they're forming preferred post-acute care networks and contemplating gain sharing. Is they are serving a lot of rural communities where those communities just do not have a whole lot of they don't have any orthopedic services, so that's why they're coming into the academic center. But then when they're being sent back home, there's only one or two home health agencies in town. There's really usually only one SNF that's going to be serving them. So academic centers are really hard pressed to be able to say, oh, well, here's our defined network, and that SNF in an outlying market isn't going to be part of it, because where is that patient going to get served? So that makes creating these preferred networks a lot more challenging, and I think that just kind of amplifies Fred G's earlier points around the overall cost structure challenges that academic centers typically face.
Well, I guess that sort of leads me to a logical issue about negotiating these collaboration agreements, which we got a question on the queue here, which we'll answer after this, but I mean, just getting these collaboration agreements implemented between, your physician practices and your post-acute network, which I would assume would include, home health, maybe an IRF, a SNF, is going to take time. You're going to have to negotiate the quality metrics that are going to go into that. And, keep in mind the hospital has to retain 50% of the downside and can only allocate 25% of the remaining downside, if there is downside, to a single provider. So there's really limits on the ability of hospitals to shift risk to non-hospital providers. But I guess one question I had is, what are these agreements actually going to look like? We have just anecdotally seen, before bundle payments, a lot in the Pioneer, ACO, and commercial managed care alternative payment contracts. Features such as, readmission, increase or decrease rates, length of stay, sort of coupled with that. And in some cases, one of these criteria in these gain sharing agreements is sort of a gating feature, meaning if you don't hit the number, you get no gain sharing. It's not sort of an incremental step basis. And then, for example, length of stay or other FIM gain might be more incremental in terms of the ability to access gains or losses. But I'm just curious, guys, where do you think, how do you think these contracts are going to kind of lay out? I mean, my own perception is that some of, when hospitals are negotiating with an individual home health agency, for example, I would think that one feature of the gain sharing will be the actual conduct of the provider itself in treating patients. How effective, how efficient is the provider. But I'm also thinking that there probably should be a feature that is sort of tied to the overall bundle and all the providers, so that the parties can sort of equally share in that. Increasingly, as sort of the years go by, to encourage people to sort of collaborate and work together, particularly if joint investments are needed. So I haven't actually, in my own mind, identified how this is all going to work out. I think there's leverage and incentives on both sides, but my own perception is some kind of a set of metrics that sort of both incentivize and bind the parties together makes some sense. But I'd be interested in knowing your thoughts too.
Yeah, I think you make. Go ahead, Fred.
No, Fred, please.
I'll just add a couple comments. I agree with what you're saying, Chris. I think a factor that binds everybody together to collaborate is going to be so important. I mean, engaging the physician to really care about what happens in the post-acute environment and what the cost structure is in the hospital will be significant. And I would envision some kind of upside being given to the physicians for that coordination and input and identifying the lower cost post-acute environment that meets the patient's needs. I think it may be more difficult for a hospital to get a physician to take downside risk.
Yeah.
One of the things that is not included in the program is that, as I think Fred B. mentioned earlier, you can give upside without rewarding downside to the same entity. There's no reciprocity or reciprocal nature of the upside and downside that's required. So in bringing someone into taking downside, you no doubt need to entice them with some upside, but that'll be a challenge. It may be particularly for the higher cost entities that are significantly above the regional cost. They may have trouble finding people to take downside risk, and it'll really take a strategy to get them there.
Yeah, and that's my experience with the gain sharing arrangements that have cropped up sort of pre-CJR between hospitals and orthopedic surgeons, and I'm thinking of some of the arrangements that were set up through, I think it was part of the ACE demo way back when, sort of the proto bundled payment initiative that even predated BPCI, as well as some of the BPCI-related arrangements. Those were almost universally upside only between the hospitals and the physicians. So they were going to be made whole regardless of what happened, but could gain quite significantly if savings were achieved. And I think those arrangements were successful in standardizing device use. And I do think hospitals, as challenging as CJR may seem or could be in terms of implementation and management and ultimately accountability, there is that renewed opportunity to get surgeons to the table and start to align incentives. What I think is really interesting with CJR, and this gets back to your question, Chris, around sort of how we see these playing out. Some of the early work that we're doing with our hospital clients is really looking at what does not only what do costs look like overall across physicians, but what does post-acute care utilization look like on a physician by physician basis, and some really interesting patterns. So that it's not only is there variation in post-acute care utilization from market to market, or even between hospitals within a given market, but even perhaps not surprisingly from surgeon to surgeon or physician to physician. There's a lot of difference. So I think there's critical work to and not necessarily that you would structure gain sharing necessarily. You can't do that surgeon by surgeon necessarily, or you would want to, because that would become incredibly onerous. But that's some of the analytic work that needs to be done to really understand what are the different patterns here and how do we start to inflect that.
Yep. Yeah, excellent point.
Yeah.
I just, the one thing we talked about a little bit earlier, and I don't want to get us off on a tangent here, but we talk about collaborators primarily. We've been talking a lot about post-acute providers and physicians, but, as everybody probably saw yesterday, there's been this year, there's been some major M&A activity in the medical device area. Yesterday, Abbott announced its takeover of St. Jude Medical. And I think, the implant and the device manufacturers are the ones that I think are seeing this as a further pressure on their pricing model, and I would suspect are trying to figure out how they can become participants based on various new pricing or outcome sensitive business models associated with the sale of their devices to the hospitals. But let me just want to mention that, and one thing that kind of comes out of this, guys, and I'm kind of curious as your thoughts on it. I mean, I think by and large hospitals haven't been aggregators of post-acute assets in terms of purchasing them. I think we've sort of, we've gone through it. We were in a cycle a while ago, and And I think over the past, let's just say, many years, hospitals have sort of been divesting themselves, generally speaking, of those assets and acquiring physician practices. Do you think we're now in a mode, if the bundled payment momentum continues, that hospitals will consider reacquiring some of those assets, or do you think that's going to be too capital intensive and they'll prefer to, simply negotiate the risk up to the 25% limit they can here? Do you think there's going to be any strategic or M&A activity associated with a bundle at this point in terms of that area?
I think I wouldn't be surprised if there is. I've had clients hospital clients that bought nursing homes, and they found that they didn't run them particularly well because the cost structures were so different in a hospital and in a SNF.
Yeah.
And they ended up selling them. But I think with the readmission risk that is put on hospitals and the bundled payment programs, and I think this is just scratching the surface of what's coming. I think they'll be getting vertically into all provisions of care is going to be something we'll see much more of.
Yeah, I would just add that it's interesting. So the AHA actually tracks this and has been tracking this for, I want to say, 20 years now, hospital ownership of home health and SNF assets. And, I think, Chris, as you were alluding to, and it also underscores your point, Fred, that early on, when it was being tracked, much higher ownership rates, that has really dropped off. I think it's kind of leveled off, and I keep tracking, because I'm a data nerd, tracking that data to see, are we going to see an uptick as a result of hospitals taking on more risk and wanting to, really own and control and manage more, or potentially want to own and manage more of the post-acute continuum. So the national data don't necessarily speak to that. You do see this in markets, though. Chris, up your way in Boston, I think I think it's Stewart and Partners have both been pretty aggressive about expanding their relatively limited post-acute care footprints. I also think you're going to see a lot more joint ventures. We were just working with a large academic center out west that is in the final steps of doing a major joint venture arrangement with a home health agency. I think the challenge, though, is, well, there are a couple of big challenges. One is the economics, particularly in terms of skilled nursing and other segments, IRF, LTAC, absolutely, is just really challenging. And I think, Fred, it gets to your point that they found that they were not managing it well. The cost structure is different. And also the case is that unless you can get into this in a big way, into the post-acute segments, because the margins are so thin and it's such a challenging set of businesses to manage, a lot of hospitals found they had subscale post-acute assets. And they were sort of chronically underinvested in, and as a result, it just made more sense for them to divest those. So, you could see this in markets, perhaps like Boston, where there's a lot more risk and it makes sense to vertically integrate. But I don't think it's necessarily going to be something we see a lot of in the next couple of years. I do think it's more a matter of let's understand what's going on here, who should we be partnering with, and how can we manage our network more effectively.
Gotcha. That makes sense. Hey, listen, just a housekeeping matter. I've been told to announce the code for the CLE, and I want to make sure people get that, and I'm going to do that right now. So the code for this program is N as in Nancy, 326N as in Nancy. One more time, N326N. And both of those are N as in Nancy. What I'd like to, I think I have one more question for both you guys, and then there's a lot of questions we have on the electronic bulletin board here, and I'd like to answer at least a couple of those before we sign off. But before we leave our sort of kind of prepared remarks, people like things in bite-sized pieces. What are the three things providers have to do now to prepare for CJR? Fred B., why don't I throw that one your way, and then I can ask the other Fred and see what his thoughts are.
So the three things I would say is, and it's a sort of a recap of one of my earlier points, is you've got to bring in the data, you've got to make sense of it, and more specifically, understand how you're performing relative to your regional cost structure, or compared to your competitors in your market and your census region. Start to understand where are the opportunities for, or where are the levers to reduce costs. That's one piece around the data component. I think it is starting to look at, above and beyond that, what are the clinical processes in place around managing the entire episode of care, and where can we start to standardize? Where's the low-hanging fruit there? And maybe it's starting on the inpatient side, but very quickly looking at both the pre and the post-acute components of that. And then I would also start looking at who are the physicians and who are the post-acute organizations that we want to develop strategic partnerships with. Maybe that's part of a preferred network, maybe it's Gainsharing, but who are the partners that we really think are going to help us elevate performance on cost and quality for our lower joint business?
Yeah, no, I agree completely. Those are the keys. And identifying situations, have protocols in place where you can identify what is the low-cost protocol for post-acute, post-discharge, where the patient should be cared for on a post-discharge basis consistent with quality medicine. I think that's going to be a real saver.
Terrific. Thank you, guys. It's 2:03, but I'd like to answer a couple of questions from the bulletin board, if it's okay. And actually, maybe we'll answer this one about, there's a question here, it kind of ties into what you were saying, Fred B., a little bit. It says, the operational costs of implementing collaboration agreements appear very onerous, given that the reconciliations will occur twice and long after the year of performance. Do you have advice on how to minimize implementation costs? I think I understand this question, because you can really see this is not going to be, a simple matter from the standpoint of like doing a needs assessment, a capabilities assessment, getting your arms around your existing data, and then going and negotiating with the right parties, with the right metrics, implementing that with software, collecting the data, and then reconciling it later. This seems like a program that could require additional hiring, and the question is how. I mean, maybe it's more in your direction on the consulting and strategy side, Fred B. How do you make this as easy as possible to do, or is it just good planning and hiring a good consulting firm?
Well, there you go. Exactly. No, I think it's a great question, and it's a huge challenge, and I think. What I would advise is first and foremost being very targeted about and strategic about where you want to develop these agreements, and really trying to manage the total number of agreements that you're going to create, so that you're not creating not only additional operational costs but administrative headaches, and trying to not only and it's a lot of work we do just helping clients in their reconciliation interactions with CMS. It's a whole other thing when you're managing the Gainsharing piece. So I think it is a matter of really being disciplined about who are we going to work with, how do we structure this in a way that we're going to be looking at data that we can collect that's already existing, or that we're going to be getting from CMS as a part of the CJR program, so that we're not having to do a lot of different data feeds. But I think the reality is you ultimately have to do that cost benefit for the high volume SNFs that we might want to do a Gainsharing arrangement with. Obviously, same story on the physician side, or other post-acute providers as well. It's really looking at, do we really think that through this Gainsharing arrangement we can inflect performance in such a way, and more specifically generate sufficient savings that it will offset the startup costs. I also think, and this is not something you can necessarily do because the program has just started, but hopefully you've got good data systems in place, and you're starting to track performance and have a way of managing that. And there are solutions out there. We've got one that we've been building to help make sense of the data. But yeah, unfortunately, I don't think there are sort of easy, quick hit ways to minimize the costs of this.
Yeah, just as you were talking there, I mean, a lot of things strike you, like the number of collaborators. I mean, do you need 4 or 5 different home health agencies, or can you go use one? Obviously, administratively, one would be better. A little bit of a risk in having just one too, if that agency is incurring losses or increasing readmission risk. And then you've got just sort of geographic and community-based preferences that people will want to and have the right to choose where they get their service. So it's almost, I hate to say it, but it almost seems that some of those strategic decisions, Fred, are market by market. So I think all your points are excellent ones, and I think ones that like you said, planning is proper. But I think the last thing you said there about collecting data and having your systems in place, so that as you marshal a plan out, you at least start to build a foundation on it. And the good news, I guess, is for hospitals, the first year there isn't the downside risk, which I'm assuming was intentional. We're over the top now. I'm going to maybe pick another question here. We got a bunch of them coming in, but one question related to whether you could have can a hospital maintain a separate gain sharing arrangement for implants for DRG 469 and 470 separate from the CJR program? Fred B., what do you think about that? I'm sorry, Fred G. That's a legal question. I would.
You can, but you wouldn't have waivers, and there were a variety of advisory opinions issued in the gain sharing arena, and you would want to consult those. The laws, there are some laws that you are implicated by that, so you have to be very careful on how you structure those things. There have been some favorable advisory opinions, and I would urge you to pay attention to them as you do it and be very careful.
Sounds good. And then we had one more question, and I think we've answered it, but there was a question related to whether the waivers for the CJR program are sort of self-operative or they have to be elected. And people who are familiar with the ACO program, the final fraud and abuse waivers that came out of the ACO program, the board of directors of the ACO has to, for example, find that the participation agreement or the subject to the waiver is related to the ACO program. It then has to post the fact that the waiver has been elected on its website so that CMS and the OIG can audit the existence of the waiver. The CJR program, basically looking at the 4 corners of the regs that have been issued so far, don't have that kind of mechanism in it. They're basically self-operative. There's the programmatic waivers like the 3-day hospital stay and telehealth and the Incident 2 regulations. And then there are some fraud and abuse waivers, basically with respect to the gain sharing, but those don't require the same, type of procedure as we see in the ACO final waivers from CMS. Having said that, though, the quality criteria that are selected by the hospital to select collaborators have to be rolled into their compliance plan, which in turn has to be adopted by the board. So the technical answer, I think, would be no, but the practical answer is that there has to be a formal adoption of the compliance elements and waivers that are applicable to the CJR by the hospital as part of its overall compliance plan. So you in a way, maybe sort of get to the same place, although technically there's a difference in the law. Somebody asked me to repeat the code again for the CLE, which I'm going to do right now. And again, it's N is in Nancy, 326, N is in Nancy. We've got a bunch of other questions, but I think it's we're already 11 minutes over the top, and I think at this point we're going to call it. And if anybody else has any questions, I think our information is on the decks there for Avalier and for our contact information for Avalier and for Foley and Lardner. And I just want to thank our colleagues at Avalier for co-sponsoring this event with us. And I wish everybody on the phone the best of luck in implementing their CJR strategy and attending today's event. And with that, I'm going to close the conference out and wish everybody a happy Friday. Thank you.
All right. Thanks a lot. Bye-bye.
Thanks, Fred.